Good morning, everyone. I'm the Reverend William Levwood, and my pronouns are he and him. Happy to serve as the minister here at Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. So, as we begin our service, let's take a deep breath, close your apps, silence your phones. Let's take another deep breath. We begin this Easter morning by calling forth and honoring the people who have made each of us, our biological and spiritual ancestors, teachers, and guides. We call forth those who imagined and made this congregation possible and who've sustained it up to this present day. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land, who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move towards healing so that all together shall know full justice. So for our chalice lighting this morning, I actually want to have you join us in the words, which are open mind, loving heart, helping hand. So as we light our flaming chalice, the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist faith, we remember that this is the church of the open mind, the loving heart, and the helping hands.
Good morning. Happy final Easter to everyone at Accotink. We welcome you to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church live stream worship service. My name is Nancy Melito, and I am your worship associate today. We are a welcoming, inclusive community seeking to create a more just and compassionate world. You are welcome here, no matter whom you love, no matter your identity or heritage, your beliefs, your background, your means, or your abilities. You are welcome here in this religious community. Are you new to Accotink? Want to know more about our church? Please reach out by using the chat box, and we'll be happy to connect you with our minister, Reverend William Levwood, or one of our greeters. Please check us out on our website, www.accotinkuu.org, for the order of service and our events page for upcoming gatherings and other news. Longtime members, newcomers, or in between, please stay for our virtual coffee hour immediately after this service. And if you are here in person, please stay for socializing. Coffee to come in following weeks. We're delighted that you've joined us today. Welcome. The Bread Pet, a sourdough story, written by Kate DePalma, illustrated by Nelleke Verhoff. It seemed like forever I've been waiting for my uncle to visit again. "Mom, Mama," I shouted, "look!" They waved to JB's rusty camper as it stopped. I ran to greet him. "Hey, Butterbean," he said. "Thought I'd stop in on my way out west. Could you look after something for me while I'm gone?" "Of course," I said. "You know I love your goldfish." "Not just Paquito," he replied. "Cora, meet my bread pet," said JB. "It's sourdough with bacteria and fungi growing inside it." "Gross!" I backed away. "Gross and awesome!" exclaimed JB. "Bacteria and fungi are alive. They eat the dough and change it. The fungi make it rise up light and fluffy. The bacteria give it a nice sour taste." I took a closer look at the goo. "So it's really alive?" JB showed me how to stir water and flour into the bread pet to feed it. "It's called starter because you can use it to start a new loaf of sourdough bread," he explained. "Until you're ready to bake, keep feeding it. It gets hungry twice a day." JB gave me a note with instructions, then frowned. I feel like there's something I'm forgetting to tell you, he said. I shrugged. Seems pretty easy. Feeding the bread pet turned out to be a lot of work. I had to measure the sticky bread pet and the flour and the water, making sure I had the amounts right and trying not to make a mess. The first day, I tried to give the job to someone else. Mom said, "No way." Mama just laughed. None of us knew how soon things would get out of control. It only took a couple of days for the bread pet to outgrow the biggest mixing bowl in the house. Mom suggested we move it to a bucket. Mama split it into 2 containers, and then 4, and then 8. We had flour in our hair and bread pets oozing all over the kitchen. How did the bread pet grow so quickly? If 1 bowl turns into 2 bowls, then I started drawing. I couldn't even write the next line without running off the page. I tried to imagine what the kitchen was going to look like in a few days. I gulped.
All that sourdough starter growing and growing and growing, bursting out of the jars, overflowing out of the windows. I can. In fact, I imagine that's what our pledge drive is going to be like this year. The giving just growing and growing and growing so that the love of this community can continue to burst out of the jars and overflow out of the windows of this building. Jesus told a very short parable about leaven, which is what sourdough starter is. The kingdom of heaven, he said, is like leaven that a woman hid in 3 measures of flour until all the dough had risen. That's what sourdough starter does, what leaven does. It makes the bread dough rise. And even though in this story we just heard there's a lot of leaven, it doesn't take much to make the bread dough rise. A little leaven, when it's shared, when it's mixed into the dough, goes a long way. I think this is one way that we can understand the resurrected Jesus. That mixed into the dough, the resurrected Jesus makes the bread rise. Takes the ground seed grain, no longer alive, and brings it back to life so it can feed and nourish all of us. Notice the use of the word rise. On Easter, Jesus is said to have risen from the dead. And when leaven is kneaded into the dough, anybody kneading your dough, your modeling clay? When leaven is kneaded into dough, the bread rises. And when we eat the bread, especially when we share our bread with each other, the love rises. It grows within us. I once heard Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Lindy Ramsden, describe Unitarian Universalists as leaven. She pointed out that there aren't that many of us, not enough to be the bread dough, but enough to be the leaven, enough to be hidden and mixed into the dough so the bread dough will grow, will be transformed, brought back to life. There's just enough of us to make the bread dough rise and come to life. Notice also that word dough and that word bread. Anybody know what those sometimes are used as a signifier of? Some of you are seeing where I'm going with this. Money, yes! So let's raise some bread, raise some dough through our pledge drive so the leaven can be hidden and mixed into the dough so that our world will continue to be transformed, will be resurrected and reborn and made new. Can you see it? The love bursting out of the jars, overflowing out of the windows?
Why does JB even keep this stupid bread pet? I grumbled to myself. Mom stuck her head in the doorway. He keeps it so he can bake bread, silly. Didn't you see the recipe on the back? She waved JB's crumpled note at me. Do you think JB would mind if we baked some? I asked. No, Mom said, laughing. I think he'd like that. So that's what we did. The first loaf was a little flat, but Mom said we'd get better at it with time. Baking some of the bread pet didn't solve our problem. It was growing faster than we could bake. I am sick of all this mess, said Mama after a few days. I am sick of all this bread, I replied. You know, said Mom, we might be sick of this bread, but there are a lot of people who'd be thankful to have something like this to eat. That gave me an idea. I asked Mom if she'd help me bake one more loaf to share. It turned out perfectly, golden and puffy with a heavenly smell. We sliced it carefully and wrapped it up before we walked together to the community hall. The smell followed us up the road. Our community hall was a busy swirl of people and sounds and food. The director, Toya, thanked us for our donation, and I watched my bread move through the room. It was passed around the tables of people, and just like that, it was gone. Are you okay, sweetie? Toya asked. I poked around in my brain for the right words. I just didn't think it would be gone so fast. When we got home, I went straight into the kitchen. There were even more bowls of oozy goo than I remembered. Arr, Paquito, I'm only one person. I can't bake all this bread myself. Paquito opened and closed his little circle mouth, and the bread pet just bubbled. All of the bread pets just bubbled. That gave me another idea. I thought of something else we can try, I said. It took Mama, Mom, and me working together to load my wagon up with our gooey jars and containers. They rattled all the way to the community hall. Toya looked a little surprised to see us. Cora, she said, you're back. The sign of the wall reads, free sourdough starter and baking class. Bring a clean container for your bread pet. The next day, the cafeteria at the community hall was full. Toya and I taught everyone about bread pets and how to care for them, and of course, how to bake the bread. Toya even knew some things I didn't, like that bread pets grow much more slowly if you keep them in the fridge. I wish I'd known that sooner. Toya asked if anyone had a question for us. At the back of the class, someone raised their hand. Hey, Butterbean, said a familiar voice. Did I forget to tell you to put that in the fridge?
So you should have gotten a loaf or a fish when you came in, or you might have printed it at home. I should have them to show. So just like the starter, and then eventually the bread, and then eventually the ability to care for your bread pet, your starter, just as that grew, we want to think about what we want to grow. So you can write on your loaf or your fish. In fact, I'm asking you to write on there something that you want to grow. Maybe love, truth, justice, maybe butterflies. I don't know. But you think about it and you write on your loaf or fish what you want to grow. And you can also decorate it on the front or the back with any other doodles or any other words that you want. And while you do that, I want you to think about the end of the story. Did anybody notice what happened at the end of the story? Do you think that Cora's Uncle JB, do you think Uncle JB really forgot to tell her about putting the sourdough starter in the fridge? Or do you think maybe he forgot on purpose? That perhaps he meant for the sourdough starter to keep growing and then to continue growing and growing. Could it be that he wanted there to be too much so that Cora would have to give it away? There's a similar thing happening in Jesus' parable of the leaven. We're told that the leaven is hidden, that it's mixed into 3 measures of flour. But it turns out that 3 measures of flour, the words for measure doesn't mean like 3 cups. That actually that's several pounds of flours. Too much flour, in fact, for one woman to bake on her own. Too much for one person's household. Just like JB, the woman in Jesus' parable means to share the dough. To share in the working of the dough, the kneading of the dough, to share the baking of the dough, the eating of the bread with others. The kingdom of heaven, which is compared to leaven in Jesus' parable, which today we might call the beloved community, is meant to grow and be shared. The woman plans to share that harvest with others. She may even plan to teach others about making the bread like Cora does in the story. This imagery is present throughout Jesus' teachings. We see it also in the story of the loaves and fishes. Now, in that story, a huge crowd gathers to listen to Jesus share his message, and Jesus' disciples come to him, concerned because they have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Not enough, not nearly enough to feed all the people who've showed up. But Jesus isn't concerned. He breaks the bread and starts sending it around. And in the end, there is enough food for everyone to eat and be satisfied. And in fact, afterwards, the disciples find baskets with leftovers, with more food. The implication being that miraculously, not only was there enough food to feed the gathered multitude, but that the loaves and fishes multiplied so that there was more than enough. Now, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that the miracle was that the gathered already had food, and that inspired by Jesus' example, everyone shared what they had with everyone else. That it was, in fact, a stone soup story. I wonder, it seems to me that's so obvious. Maybe that's why we never point that out. Do you remember the stone soup story? 2 travelers come and they say that they're going to make some stone soup, and they put 2 stones in a bowl, and then they say, boy, this soup is great, but it sure would be better with some potatoes. And then somebody goes and brings some potatoes, and they say, wow, it's really coming along, but if only we had some carrots. And somebody brings carrots, and then on and on and on like that, until the whole village is fed off that stone soup, now filled with onions and garlic and salt. And so I think that that's what happened in the loaves and fishes story. And that just like the sourdough starter in our other story, there's more than enough to go around. That all that was needed, no pun intended, was for the sourdough starter or the loaves and the fishes to be shared, so that everyone sharing what they had created a feast, enough for a whole village and then some.
This is how I imagine the resurrection. A reading written by our own Reverend William Levwood. This is how I imagine the resurrection, which was and wasn't found in the tomb. which was just a cave after all. The account tells us there was no body. But what do we really care about a corpse? I want to know what was there, not what wasn't. This is how I imagine the resurrection, with paintings covering the walls of the cave, Renaissance frescoes depicting the parables of Jesus, the woman mixing yeast into dough, the disciples gathered round, readying the feast, the loaves and fishes multiplying. This is how I imagine the resurrection. The cave of the tomb an oven, the smells of freshly baked loaves flowing out from where the stone was rolled away. Sunlight, water, wheat, and love come to life in the bread, abundant and fragrant. This is how I imagine the resurrection. A banquet laid out. Bread and fish and cheese, olives and figs and dates and wine. And the people talking and singing. The people gathered around the table, turning their mourning into dancing. Eating and praying and learning together. The spirit of love is community gathered together, with the love taking the form of bread shared freely. The spirit of love continuing on like heaven, like a revelation that once revealed cannot be veiled again. A resurrection continually dying and reborn that goes out from the tomb of the cave, out from the oven of the heart, out from the crucible of the church, to be a light of love for all and forever. This is how I imagine the resurrection.
So you heard Dave Muirhead say that we are the bread. So I want to focus in on that for just a moment. Jesus said, we're the leaven, we're the bread of life. And in the Eucharist, in the communion ritual, the risen Christ is taken into the body so that we too can be reborn, transformed to provide nourishment to others. I'm reminded that Clarence Jordan, who started the first interracial farm in America in 1942, just to give you context, the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman started the first intentionally interracial church in San Francisco in 1944. So in 1942, Clarence Jordan started an interracial farm in Americus, Georgia. A bold thing to do. So Clarence Jordan said that the parables of Jesus are like a Trojan horse. They're meant to be beautiful and simple so that we let them in easily, not really realizing that they're going to turn our lives upside down, that we're going to be changed, that we're going to be transformed, that like that bread dough, we're going to rise. So I want to say that this beloved community is a place where we are the bread of life to each other, where we are the yeast for each other, where we not only come to gather and support each other, but to be transformed. We could say even reborn or resurrected. So with that in mind, may we mix the leaven into the dough of our communal life together. It isn't also an individual transformation that we're looking for. It's a transformation of the whole. Remember I said kingdom of heaven. Today we would probably say beloved community. So we want that beloved community to be transformed. So may it be so, and may we be among those who make it so. Amen, 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 and blessed be.
As we extinguish our chalice, I invite you to join me now in our community blessing. I invite you to rise as you are willing and able, and to simply put your hands out in honor of our longtime tradition and in the hope that soon we may be able to hold hands again. Please recite with me, "This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars." We pause now in silent witness to that unity.
On this Easter Sunday, may the jars burst. May the yeast of love and transformation flow out from the windows. May you have a joyful day celebrating, and may you find lots of Easter eggs.